Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Richard Orme from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host for today's webinar, A World Tour of Inclusive Publishing Initiatives. Okay, let's get started. This week is a little different to our previous sessions that we've run, in that we're doing more of a group discussion, and we're going to try a couple of polls. So for a group discussion, we need a group, our panel. So at this point, I'll hand over to each of our panelists who will introduce themselves. So starting with you, Brad.
Hello, Brad Turner, hailing from the San Francisco Bay Area. I run global literacy and education at Benetech. So that includes Bookshare, but importantly for this discussion, it includes a program called Global Certified Accessible, which is an accessibility program that trains publishers how to produce accessible material and then provides them a marketing vehicle to prove to others that they have passed a certification, an accessibility certification.
Great. Brad, thank you for that. And Deborah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Deborah Nelson, and I come from Toronto, Canada, where I work at eBound, which is a not-for-profit corporation whose sole mandate is to help Canadian publishers play in the digital marketplace. So that includes the creation of content and the selling and marketing and distribution of content around the world. Over the last year, we have partnered with ACP to do a lot of research into accessibility, and I look forward to sharing that with you as the hour goes on. Thank you.
Deborah, thank you. And now let's turn to Hugo. Hugo, please tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Richard. Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Richard, thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to share this panel with such distinguished panelists. My name is Hugo Setzer. I am a publisher, an academic publisher in Mexico City, and I suppose I have been invited because I sit with Richard on the Accessible Books Consortium advisory board. At the same time, I'm also currently president of the International Publishers Association, where we represent through 83 publishers associations in 69 countries, thousands of publishers all around the world. So thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Hugo, and for setting out why we've invited you onto the panel. You were characteristically modest. And now let's turn to Kirsi. Kirsi, please tell us about yourself.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Kirsi Ylänne, and I'm currently in Finland, in Helsinki, so it's evening here. I work at the CDA library for the persons with print disabilities, and I'm representing here NIPI, N-I-P-I, that comes from the words Nordic Inclusive Publishing Initiative, which is 5 Nordic North European countries, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And I'm also current chair of IFLA section called Libraries Serving Persons with Print Disabilities. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Well, I'm very happy we've assembled such a stellar panel for our discussion. We'll hear a lot more from you later. So the overview of today's session is to start with a whistle-stop tour. This is, I'm afraid, me reading through some slides, but telling you about inclusive publishing initiatives that are happening in different countries and regions all around the world. And we'll hear examples from North and Latin America, from Europe, from Africa, and from Australia also. After the whistle-stop tour, which I hope I can move through fairly briskly, we'll then have the bulk of our session, which is the panel discussion. We have some pre-prepared questions, which the panel don't know quite how they'll come at them, and we also want to keep it fresh. So keep your questions coming in, we'll respond to those, and we'll answer the questions that are important to you. During the session, we'll also be trying out audience polls, and this is for the first time, so please bear with us if it doesn't go entirely smoothly, but the panel and I felt it would be wonderful to learn a little bit more about our audience and also what you perceive to be the key barriers to inclusive publishing moving forward where you are. So questions at any time. So the first poll then, we'd like to know about you. This poll will be magically starting now, I am told. It should come up on your screen and you can tell us where in the world you are and also what type of organization you are representing or working within. So we'll be closing that poll towards the end of the world tour of the Whistle Stop Tour, but let's move quickly into that. So a whistle stop tour, not everyone is familiar with that terminology. This is a trip during which someone visits many different places in a short period of time. So let's try that out. Turning first to Canada. Well, accessible publishing has been a live topic in Canada for some time, with 2 industry events, Tech Forum and eBook Craft, featuring accessibility for more than 10 years. More recently, NELS, which is a network of accessible library services, well, they've developed a popular annual conference. Organizations such as CNIB, that's the Canadian National Institute of the Blind, and library groups have been raising the issue of inclusive publishing with policymakers. And in March 2019, as we heard from Deborah, the Government of Canada announced an investment of over $22 million over 5 years to support the sustainable production and distribution of accessible digital books by Canadian independent publishers. The goal of the initiative is to enhance industry capacity so that books are born accessible as part of the digital production process. Well, that sounds to me like inclusive publishing. An accessibility landscape research report was published in March 2020, and this suggests next steps, which include the development of an online publisher toolkit, establishing a shared data bank of training resources and best practices, piloting a Canadian certification scheme before potentially scaling this up to a national system, outreach to retail partners. Well, this is to ensure that accessible content is available for purchase, and expanding research into how to best support the distinct needs of the Canadian trade and educational markets. So there was significant focus in Canada on accessible publishing before the announcement of the government funding, and I think it goes without saying there's been a lot of interest since. Let's move south of the border now to the United States. The Book Industry Study Group is an industry group that maintains and implements standardized best practice in the publishing industry. And in 2016, BISG published the Quick Start Guide to Accessible Publishing. And this was a landmark publication setting out why accessibility is important. It set out the business case for accessibility, how to create accessible content, legal requirements, and it includes a top tips section as well as listings of resources. The guide had many contributors, including publishers, vendors, accessibility experts, and end users. And from all the conversations and putting that together, grew the question about how to ensure that a title is in fact accessible. This is increasingly important to institutions such as universities and school districts that had legal imperatives to ensure that digital titles that they're adopting are in fact accessible. Customer demand is especially strong, especially in the world of higher education publishing, and publishers have responded to this with vigor. Indeed, early in this series of webinars, we featured a publisher's face-off, where publishers submitted titles straight off their production line for scrutiny. If you go back and watch the video of that session, you will see that we saw highly accessible digital titles with features such as great structure, detailed images, described images, extended descriptions, page markup, navigable tables, and accessible math. It's just wonderful to see publishers proud of their accessibility achievements and turning this into a marketing asset. Now, as part of assessing those titles, the panel put them through the Benetech Global Certified Accessible process, which Brad mentioned in the introduction. As the name suggests, this isn't only for the US, but this is where it's moved fastest. The program supports a publisher or vendor to get their workflow to a point where they can be confident that the titles coming off the line are accessible to a high standard. Titles that can then be GCA certified, and because of this, then comes the assurance of a trusted third party, that both they and their customers can be confident in their purchasing choices. And increasingly, in book distribution platforms, you'll see accessibility metadata, including whether the title has been certified as accessible by the publisher or the gold standard by a third party. I hope in the discussion, Brad will expand a little bit more on how technical advice for publishers, common standards, and certification can fit into an accessible publishing ecosystem. Now, while we're in the United States, I should mention that the ebook services of big tech companies, such as Amazon and Google, they're also investing in accessibility. They pay attention to the accessibility of their ebook reading apps and devices, and they love to accept accessible EPUB into their systems. Okay, let's move further south to Brazil, and there is a lot to tell you about Brazil. The Brazilian law on the inclusion of persons with disabilities is to ensure rights and freedoms for people with disabilities, aiming at social inclusion and citizenship. And the inclusion law is wide-ranging, but has specific provisions that impact on accessible publishing. Users can ask for any book sold in a bookstore or online to be supplied in an accessible format. This is typically digital, and EPUB 3 is preferred. And images must be described, and the book must be well formulated and adapted. Books with more than 10,000 copies when they're launched, well, they must be available at the same time as publication in this digital accessible format. Trade books, well, if they're not already available, then they have up to 30 days to be delivered to the end customer, and books with more complex content, well, that has to be delivered in between 30 and 60 days. How's this organized? Well, the major publisher associations have websites where the requests can be made, and usually publishers hire professionals or specialized companies to do the job if it's not already done. And as publishers are starting to author and produce books for digital use, they're including accessibility in their workflow. Turning to the public sector, all books that are purchased by government departments for libraries, schools, or other programs, these must be delivered in accessible formats. It's a huge operation. So there are nearly 900 books in the National Textbook Program for the public schools, including literature and complex textbooks. And so the production of these as accessible titles includes the creation of more than 100,000 complex pages, so math, geography, biology, etc., with more than 300,000 described images and around 100,000 math and chemical formulae. Math expressions are in MathML, and image descriptions are done in accordance with a set of guidelines. And since 2019, all textbooks for the first 5 grades of school are also delivered in Braille. This involves the conversion of around 70,000 complex pages into Braille and the printing of more than 10 million pages. So a lot going on in Brazil. Let's now cross the ocean to Europe. And I'm not going to dwell long on this slide on the Nordic countries. We have Kirsi. So Kirsi maybe later on can mention some of the characteristics and the activities in the discussion time. But in this whistle-stop tour, I wanted to highlight the approach that's being taken by some countries with small populations and that speak many languages where the numbers of speakers is comparatively small. In the Nordic countries, organizations that serve people with print disabilities are collaborating as a partnership, working with the publishing organizations. So NIPI, as Kirsi mentioned, is a network which currently represents Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. Let's though turn to 2 other European countries, stopping off first at Italy. Well, the LEA Foundation began in 2011 as a project carried out by the Trade Association of Italian Publishers and has since become a foundation. LEA was originally conceived to increase access to publishing for people with print disabilities living in Italy, and the initial project looked at all aspects of the supply chain with a view to making them all accessible. They set up a purchasing model which makes it possible for a person with print impairment to search for and procure accessible content. And this national catalogue of accessible ebooks has grown, and today it features more than 25,000 accessible digital ebooks, and more than 400 titles, mainly frontlist titles, are added every month. Over the years, the LEA Foundation has grown to be a centre of expertise and knowledge on the global scene, and we've benefited from their team members attending our webinar sessions, presenting at our webinar sessions related to image descriptions and the European Accessibility Act. In this whistle-stop tour, I wanted to highlight that our Italian friends benefit from a national body in the LEA Foundation with membership that includes publishers. Around 80% of trade publishers are represented, distribution platform, and end user bodies working together. The LEA Foundation is very active and present in international working groups and standard bodies, and they also offer consulting, training, conversion services to publishers, and they also do end user awareness events, and recently have been awarded European funding to extend this activity. To our next European country, and this is the Netherlands. And accessible publishing in the Netherlands, well, that's been initiated mainly by the DAISY member there, Dedicon. This began with a series of roundtable discussions in 2016 to explore the adoption of born accessible practices within mainstream publishing. This then led to the Born Accessible Publishing project, which started in 2018, and this has three main areas of activity. Awareness, which is working on increased knowledge through a series of events. A quick start guide, so this is building on the guidance which was produced as a result of the earlier roundtable sessions, and 10 new sets of guidance were produced to motivate and help everyone get started on the path to born accessible publishing. And the third area are activities to boost inclusive publishing, which includes an inventory of tools and solutions, in-company workshops, which are held to show employees how their content is viewed by people with print disabilities, and to offer guidance, and consultancy, which is offered to education and trade publishers to improve workflows and help build an action plan. So lots of new exciting developments took off as a result of these project activities, which includes implementing standards, becoming more of a priority, an education accessibility task force, and Dedicon working together with the French organization BrailleNet to develop training materials for European publishers in a range of European languages. So moving from Europe to Africa, and we're stopping off at the country of Kenya. Here we see another stakeholder group coming together, the Digital Literacy Trust. This includes publishers, distribution platforms, international development agencies, and disabled persons organizations and vendors. The area of focus of this group is focused on accessible publishing in educational materials. Teachers in Kenyan schools consistently cite the lack of accessible learning materials as the #1 challenge they face. So the Digital Literacy Trust has worked alongside the Kenyan government's Digi Schools initiative, which involves providing over 1 million tablets and laptops into the school system. DLT has developed a downloadable toolkit for publishers to help them in producing accessible EPUB. And they run a content development challenge for publishers, where publishing professionals can demonstrate their creativity and understanding of accessibility as they produce accessible digital versions of print school books. And here we see not only accessible EPUB, but EPUB with human narrated performance, sound effects to engage the learner, and indeed integrated sign language. They also organize the annual Digital Essay Competition, which is now in its 8th year. This is inclusive to all learners. It emphasizes aspects of inclusion and the benefits of technology. The Digital Literacy Trust and Ikitabu, one of the members, they contribute to developments in Readium. They use Readium as the basis of their reading apps, and they support the progress of accessible publishing in many other African countries in addition to Kenya. Ikitabu and the Digital Literacy Trust were recognized in the 2019 ABC International Excellence Awards. So we'll do one more country, and we're heading over to Australia. So the AIPI, which is the Australian Inclusive Publishing Initiative, operates under the auspices of the Australian Publishers Association. And they've managed to pull together members of all areas of the publishing industry in Australia and other stakeholders. AIPI aims to develop a greater awareness of the needs of people living with print disability, to communicate the laws that govern access to published content, and to build publishing industry capability in producing accessible digital books that are inclusive by design. Their first main deliverables are two highly readable sets of guidance. Making content accessible explains the legal environment for making books accessible to those with a print disability. And secondly, inclusive publishing in Australia is an introductory guide for publishers and those who contribute to the publishing workflow. This guide offers a set of workflow strategies for creating accessible digital books that are inclusive. Also to mention that the Australian Publishers Association is a member of the Roundtable on Information Access for People with Print Disabilities. This body has a broad membership of education, government, business, alternate format producers, community and disability organisations throughout Australia and indeed New Zealand. And this is to facilitate and influence the production and use of quality alternate formats by people with print disabilities. Last of all, in the Whistle Stop Tour, I want to reflect on an international initiative. WIPO is the Global Forum for Intellectual Property Policy, Information and Cooperation. And WIPO is an agency of the United Nations with 193 member states. WIPO is the lead agency for the Marrakesh Treaty and also hosts the Accessible Book Consortium, which has two main initiatives related to accessible publishing. The ABC International Excellence Awards is an international annual award which is presented at the London Book Fair as part of their high-profile ceremony. It recognises outstanding leadership and achievements in advancing the accessibility of digital publications for people who are print disabled. So it both recognises the award winners and the finalists, but it also promotes the issue of accessibility and inclusion in a high-profile international publishing awards event. And two awards are presented each year, one to a publisher and one for a project initiative. In 2020, the winners were Macmillan Learning from the United States in the publisher category and Lea Foundation of Italy in the initiative category. I also want to mention the ABC Charter for Accessible Publishing. And this is a charter that encourages the leadership in publishing organizations to make practical steps towards born accessible publications. By signing it, the management and leadership of publishing organizations make commitments such as developing and publishing an accessibility policy, nominating a senior manager with responsibility for accessibility, testing digital publications with people with disabilities, incorporating accessibility metadata, and many more. To date, over 100 publishers have signed the charter. Okay, so that is our Whistle Stop Tour that's intended to give you examples of different initiatives, the concrete steps that have been taken, and the different stakeholder groups that have been brought together to achieve them. So we come then to the poll results and about you. So who do we have attending the webinar? Unsurprisingly, we have 56% of our attendees on this webinar in North America, but great to see Europe very well represented with 30%. Asia is represented at 9%, and we have South America at 5%. So I think people from all around the world coming in and listening to the World Tour of Inclusive Publishing Initiatives. We also wanted to know about the types of organizations we have represented. So we actually have quite a high representation of non-profit organizations, followed up by education establishments, publishing houses, and other, together with some interested individuals. So we'll remember these answers as we have our discussions, and we'll reflect these in the answers that the panel may give. So quite a high level of interest there in non-profit organizations. I guess that's these organizations are beginning to think in themselves as advocacy organizations and thinking about how they can start the ball rolling in their countries. So let's now turn to our panel for some discussion. So I invite you to turn your cameras on, and just reflecting on the examples that we've gone through there and the number of people we have and the range of people we have attending this webinar, let's think about who are the key players in the accessibility supply chain in addition to publishers, and what should they be doing? So I wonder who'd like to address that, because we saw many of these examples involve broad stakeholder groups. Any lessons for yourselves or for people attending the webinar on the range of participants that should be involved in this journey? Who'd like to speak to that first?
Richard, I'll jump in. So, you know, one of the things that's important to remember is that if, you know, the accessibility ferry visited us all in the middle of the night and made, you know, hopefully all the content in the world accessible, that would be fantastic, but you still have to find it and buy it. And if you're at school, get it assigned to you and be able to read from it and learn from it. So there's an entire ecosystem here that I think is pretty important that we address. The publishers are a critical part of that, because if the content is accessible, nothing else matters. But once the content is accessible, you also have to you know, work with distributors, work with retailers, work with learning management systems, work with you know, the library management systems. There are lots of other pieces in the ecosystem that need to show the accessibility metadata so that people know what the features, the accessibility features of the book are, how to find it, etc.
That sounds right to me. And I think obviously I've picked these examples because these are examples where we see success. And maybe one of the characteristics of them are that they are involving stakeholders through the supply chain. Deborah, how are you getting on with that in Canada? Are you finding that you're able to engage stakeholders right through that supply chain?
Well, certainly, I'd concur with Brad that getting vendors' attention is going to be probably the biggest hurdle that we need to overcome. And that would include both commercial vendors and libraries. At this point, it's almost an example of they don't know what they don't know. You know, trying to have conversations with Amazon, and Brad, I'd love to hear your experience about this, you know, and being able to show accessibility metadata is kind of, you know, an arm's length reach for them. They keep saying that, you know, down the road, their roadmaps are full. But one of the things that I think we need to do to make sure people understand sort of the moral compulsion around this is have the user community participate in our conversation with vendors. Because if you can understand from a person with a print disability what exactly these small changes will allow them to do, I think it will help motivate our vendors and also see that there's a way to increase their market and customers.
And Hugo, how about in Mexico and Latin America? You know, you're sitting there as a publisher. How do you see others? How do you see other publishers engaging with this and others in the supply chain? I guess that maybe digital publishing is at an earlier stage than in Canada and the US, but I could be wrong. Tell us about that.
Thank you, Richard. I really like Brad's description about this, the importance of having this whole ecosystem working together and starting with publishers, because yes, we have to make sure that every day we have more and more material in accessible formats. And publishers have had an amazing response to that in our region. We are perhaps a little bit, but I wouldn't say that much far behind in digital publishing. I think the main publishing markets in Latin America, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil are the largest. We are most of the publishers are already publishing in digital formats. We have held different conversations with the publishers associations in those main markets and work together. And I know because I've had the chance to sit together with the publishers associations at least in Mexico and Colombia, for example, with the users community, with the print disabled community, to see how we can improve things, how we can have more titles in digital formats. We are working with authorities. For example, in Mexico right now, we are working publishers and the end user community together with our authorities to improve the implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty, which is also a very important step in all the different countries, signatories of the Marrakesh Treaty, to really have all this ecosystem working to have a correct implementation of the Marrakesh Treaty.
That's great. And I think I'm right in saying that many of those more than 100 publishers that have signed the Charter for Accessible Publishing are actually in Latin America. So is that correct, Hugo?
Well, yeah, there are several in Latin America. They come from all over the world, those over 100 publishers that have signed the Accessible Books Charter, and there are many in Latin America as well.
But Deborah, I think, called out two particular areas where she felt there needed to be some focus, if I understood her correctly, which is on the vendor or the retail and lending platforms. This is something that needs attention to, and also that end user community and the power, I think, of end user voices in order to drive this. Also, I was struck by the LEA Foundation, including organizations of people with print disabilities in awareness events and so on. This seems to be like an interesting model. Kirsi, is that something you have planned within the Nordic region, the engagement with the end users to drive awareness and also the voice of the end users there?
Yeah, that's our plan, that because we all five coming from the agencies that have long experience in producing accessible books for persons with print disabilities and giving the library services. So we know what are the needs of the persons with print disabilities, and we are trying to tell them, to publishers, that these are the needs. And I would also say that I totally agree with everybody that the whole ecosystem has to be accessible. I mean, at the end, it doesn't, the reader doesn't care whose responsible it is to make the whole reading experience accessible, as long as it is enjoyable. So I think that the publishers have to do their part, but also the distribution channels have to do their part. And I hope that the publishers and distribution channels talk to each other, so they make sure that the reading experience is totally accessible. And that's important, that if publisher can make a fine product, but if you go to a public library and the public library's system doesn't support all the accessibility features, then the reading experience isn't fully accessible.
Now, in the Whistle Stop tour, I mentioned Google and Amazon and mentioned the accessibility efforts they're making. And Deborah kind of called them out that there is more to do, especially possibly in the field of metadata. Are those brands also there and present in the Nordic countries, or do you have your own reading platforms and distributors that also need to understand the changes they may need to make?
Yeah, it's one characteristic for the Nordic book market is that we have very strong subscription services here. You might know Storytel. It's a sort of similar service than Spotify or Netflix are. So you pay a certain fee per month, and then you have access to the total collection of ebooks and audiobooks. And it's really important that those services make sure that they applications are accessible, so that also persons with print disabilities have the possibility to use those systems. And I would say that often it's very small things to make the navigation better. And I have to say that in past years we have seen improvement in the usability, and that benefits everybody, not just persons with print disabilities, but all users, when it's more usable to navigate audiobooks.
Well, there are different platforms then, and the platforms in your different regions all need to pay attention to accessibility. But given that publishing is an international business with titles flowing across borders, how important are international standards and norms around accessibility in order for this really to be scalable and affordable? What's the role of international standards here?
So, Richard, I can start here because the European Union, you might have found the DAISY webinar that was held, I think it's June 10th, and if you haven't, about the European Accessibility Act, and that will cover ebooks, so that all the ebooks that after June 2025 will be sold in the European market have to be accessible. So we really need those standards so that publishers can follow those standards and make sure that their books are fully compliant to the requirements.
And Brad, I'm expecting you to speak up on this. You're global certified accessible, that has the global world in that. I guess that's underpinned by international standards in order for that to be truly global.
Yeah, we use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines at a AA level, which is the most people have heard of WCAG, and that's sort of the WCAG is sort of the gold standard for accessibility, and there are 3 levels of it. We go to level 2, which includes proper navigation, table of contents, those page structure, those types of things. We also add some book-related issues to that, because if you think about the web, reading on the web is link to link to link. Reading on a book is page to page to page, and so that's where page numbers and navigation comes in. But we also make sure that, at least in our Global Certified Accessible program, that we address image descriptions, alt text, the other things that make the book fully accessible. And if you look at a publisher like Macmillan, and you mentioned them earlier, they're the first publisher to pass through our Global Certified Accessible program. And the GCA program is as much a training and education program as it is a certification, penalization. If you don't do it right, you get a penalty. It's really, hey, we'll help you learn to build books in a born accessible manner, and then turn around and give you a third-party independent certification so you can market that to organizations that are specifically looking for certified books. It's certainly in the United States, it's becoming more and more and more important as the legal mandate is at the education level. You must provide an equivalent education for all students. It's not at the publisher level, it's at the education level. But the publishers are recognizing that as they build their content in a born accessible fashion, the education institutions, especially higher ed institutions, are looking to purchase accessible content. And so now a publisher like Macmillan can say, hey, we have a third-party independent certification that we've gone through by a body that has converted millions of books into accessible formats. And that's a pretty powerful statement for the publisher. We then turn around and help them sell that as well, so that we have an accessible store hosted by by VitalSource, and VitalSource shows accessible metadata in their platform, has an accessible reader. Really, we're trying to build that entire ecosystem that I mentioned up front, so that the content is produced accessibly, the purchaser and the distributor can make it visible, the purchaser can see it, and then, as Kirsi mentioned, make sure that reading experience is great.
And Brad, those principles of accessibility that you just described in terms of alt text and structure and the book properties, these don't sound like they're specific to the US market or something like that. These are international standards that already exist. So if you're in a country that is starting out on the journey of inclusive publishing and accessibility, maybe even accessibility certification, you don't need to invent a whole load of new things. You can take what exists. Deborah, in my introduction, I talked about the fact that in Canada, you're looking to pilot a certification scheme, and I think it's described also as a pre-certification scheme, and looking at the specific needs of the Canadian market. How would you speak to this this topic of to what extent actually do the standards exist and a lot of the work's done and now it's about implementation?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So as part of our landscape research report, we had three elements. We had assessing what the current state is. So what's happening with all the various stakeholders that we've talked about during this session. We looked at what the future state looks like. And to us, we define that of the standards that we're all going to be working towards. And then the last part was the training and the awareness to bridge the gap between where we are now and where we want to get. So given that the government has $22 million and we're about a year and a half into the 5 years, we are going to start piloting actually Benetech as a sort of a microcosm of what certification will look like, so we can put some dollars and cents and human hours of effort around scaling this nationally within. So the pilot will take place this year, and then what will it look like for the 3 subsequent years to scale to about 250 Canadian publishers. So we want to make sure that we're going to be employing Canadians and employing people with print disabilities to help us with that work. Kind of keep the end user at the center of you know, our Venn, so to speak. So we're excited about going down that project, and we know we have a lot to learn.
Very good. Well, Kirsi mentioned the European Accessibility Act. Brad, you talked about the requirements that sit on education providers to ensure that education is so important. I want to put a false choice to you as panelists, maybe phrase a question this way: which is more important, or maybe these aren't important in your view, the availability of funding to help get these initiatives off the ground, or the presence of strong legislation to drive inclusive publishing forward? So maybe it's a false choice or whatever. So what are your thoughts about the roles of funding and of strong law?
Can I add a third choice, Richard?
Go ahead.
I would submit, and it's come up in this conversation already, but I would submit that user demand is probably the highest because, you know, the legislation, sure, that'll drive the publishers to do it because they have to. The funding will allow the publishers to start when they want, but when the end users start screaming for it, there's a vacuum, and they will rush to fill that vacuum, and that vacuum is, I need accessible material. And so I think it's demand from end users that makes it that is the biggest driver.
Hugo, is that important to you as a publisher making tough business decisions?
Of course, demand is important, because that's what usually we have to look at, that drives our business, to look at the demand. On the other hand, I was thinking of what you mentioned about having a strong legislation, and I perhaps would put it in different words, mentioning that it should be a correct legislation. I mean, and you explained, Richard, also the role of WIPO with the Marrakesh Treaty and the Accessible Books Consortium, in a way that the Marrakesh Treaty is a legal framework that allows many of these things to happen. It has to have a correct implementation. We have seen some mistakes in some countries while implementing the Marrakesh Treaty, so it has to be a correct legislation. And on the other hand, I think it was really a great initiative by WIPO also to launch this Accessible Books Consortium, because it's a practical way of how to start doing things and not waiting just for the legal things to happen, but to on a very practical way start working. And we have had an incredible response by publishers all around the world. IPA has been behind the Marrakesh Treaty and the ABC Consortium from the beginning, and we have been promoting all of this with our members in all over the world, and we have had really a great response. I mean, there are so many publishers right now working on making their books accessible.
Great. Well, you heard me talk through that whistle-stop tour and bringing out examples, and I hope I did all the great work that's done in all those different countries at least some justice by describing what's happening in those places. I wonder, were there any surprises to you as panelists in there, or things that you feel maybe should be highlighted more, maybe lessons even that you might pick up and borrow for your own regions? Surprises, lessons specific? Kirsi, NIPI had a little bit of a false start with the pandemic, meaning that the conference was cancelled. As you review that world, the whistle-stop tour, anything that particularly struck you that maybe you'd like to take back to the group that are collaborating together that might be interesting?
Well, I was really interested to hear what has happened in Brazil with the educational material, because I think that's really the hard part of doing accessible material. It's novels are easy when there's text only. That's not the tricky part, but how to make educational materials right from the start accessible. So that is definitely something I want to study more.
Yeah, and Regina sent in a question saying, well, this is still a challenge. How do more complex math contents be made accessible, especially the higher level math subjects with things like differential equations and graphs and calculus and so on? Now, some of those, I mentioned the publisher face-off, which if you go back and see the video, you'll see actually some of those things were submitted. They were in the titles. And I guess you see some of those come through, Brad, through the GCA. That, you know, it's not doing the easy stuff. I would say that educational material that goes through GCA, it is at that tough end, isn't it?
Yeah, that's 80% of the work is in the last 20% of the book. Chapter titles, page numbers, and text is pretty easy. When you get into the STEM topics, science, technology, engineering, actually STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, because whether it's the quadratic equation or the Mona Lisa, it still needs a description. Somebody still needs to be able to see it and be able to parse it. So whether it's alt text, whether it's a long description, all of that really more complex content needs to be described, and we focus on that in GCA. I think that's the hardest place for publishers to make the leap, because a lot of times it's not the publisher providing those descriptions. It has to be the author. The author knows why they put that image in there. It's, here's a picture of a coffee cup. Is it a coffee? Is this a picture of someone enjoying a warm beverage in the morning, or is it a picture, a science experiment to see how long a beverage will stay warm throughout the day, right? So the description comes from the author. It gets put in by the publisher, and it's that partnership that really makes that book accessible.
Very good. And of course, we have a whole webinar already in the can on image descriptions, which people are able to go back and view. But Brad, anything in that world tour that sort of struck you as surprising, or we should be thinking about that in the US or at Benetech?
No, I'll second Kirsi's nomination for Brazil. I wasn't aware that they were as far ahead as they are with forcing or guaranteeing that books are accessible for education and for trade. Producing Braille books, etc. It's great to hear that it's becoming more and more important around the world. Many of us run. Deborah mentioned it. She's nonprofit. I know Kirsi's at Celia. I'm at Benetech, which has Bookshare. So there are lots of libraries who produce content like this. But boy, it would be fantastic if publishers started to produce that content that way, so that these libraries could then become much more of almost a service for individuals with backlist items, because those individuals with print disabilities could go purchase that book. and somebody mentioned it's a better book for everybody. Whether if I take the DAISY format, which is the synchronized text and highlighted audio, I call it ebook karaoke, right? If I have a learning disability like dyslexia, that's an incredibly critical format for me. But you know what? If I'm studying for a high-level university exam, that's an incredibly important format for me because I can get the information through two different neural pathways, both my eyes and my ears. So this accessibility piece certainly addresses books for people with print disabilities, but it really benefits everybody.
Well, this is an argument that we often make in the accessibility movement. How compelling, Hugo and Deborah, do you find it that an accessible book is actually better for everyone? Does that really cut through, or is that, do you find that maybe intriguing as an argument? What are your thoughts?
Deborah, would you like to?
Sure, thank you. I think it is a compelling argument. I mean, when we go to our accessibility summit that's run by NELS, they have people from the user community demonstrating what it feels like and, the content experience for someone who is sight impaired. But we also saw people with with learning disabilities, which represents up to 10% of Canada's population. And so right away, I think it's a very compelling positioning statement because your market gets bigger and bigger. So you've got a bigger audience and you've got, a bigger market from which to play to. And I think publishers need to hear that.
Great. Well, we're coming, Hugo, just before you speak, I've just been reminded we actually have another poll we'll run just in the last few minutes of this session, which is to ask people that, having heard the discussion and thought about it, in your view, what is the most significant barrier slowing inclusive publishing where you are? So this is a quick poll. We'll do this in less than 5 minutes or so, and we'll give you those results in a second. So Hugo, back to you.
Thank you, Richard. I absolutely agree with that argument. That I think that's one of the most important arguments we make when we speak to our fellow publishers, because there are, of course, a lot of doubts and how much we will have to invest and so on and so forth. And then when we talk about how this making a book born accessible makes a better product for the market, I think that's one of the main reasons to jump into this. And of course, the main reason is because it's the right thing to do, but it's also a good business case.
Well, we've heard about business case. We've heard about the power of user voice to publishers in order to, and not just only with publishers, but with platforms. Customer demand will drive things as well as legislation and money. And Richard asked the question, that's a tough nut to crack. It's a major issue. What can be done to ensure that end users are educated about inclusive publishing and, making their voice heard? Kirsi, your experience, you work within agencies working with people with print impairments.
Yes, and tell what we've done in Finland with the Finnish Publishers Association. So we have had in the past 2 years 2 seminars about accessible books and accessible audiobooks, and we've invited persons with print disabilities to talk about their experiences using publishers' material. And when they tell that, okay, it would be nice to know what the image contains and this sort of thing, they then hear from the potential users themselves what are the problems at the moment.
Great. So I have a closing question to our panel before we reveal the answers to the last poll, which is, so for you, if you have the opportunity to ask the webinar attendees to do something or make a suggestion to move forward inclusive publishing in the region in which they are living or the sector in which they are, what would that suggestion or ask be? What would the call to action to webinar attendees be? So let's start, Deborah, with you. What's your advice or request?
Yeah, so my thought would be making sure that we are able to clearly communicate what the business model looks like by highlighting the user community, quantifying the user community, sort of running a business case to say this community could be worth this amount of money, to give the publishers the imperative to act sooner than later would be my thought.
Thank you. And Brad, what are your thoughts?
I think that the webinar attendees should learn as much as they can about Born Accessible, especially for those in the publishing and distribution community. The ability to take that first step, and sometimes that's the hardest thing. Is we talk to a number of publishers and they say, well, I don't think we're quite ready yet. We're not there. A program like Global Certified Accessible or the NIPI program, all of the people on this panel want publishers to be producing books in a Born Accessible fashion. And so I would say, take that first step, reach out to anybody on this panel or your local organization, say, how do I get started? I understand that the business case is there. I understand that it's a better book for folks. How do I get started and take that first step? I think that's important.
Great. Take the first step. The journey of 1,000 miles starts with one single step, I think is the phrase. Hugo, what about you? Your thoughts?
Thank you. And I also agree. And I would say I saw that there is a good number of publishers also watching this webinar. And I would tell publishers that from my point of view, this first step would be to sign the Accessible Books Charter of the Accessible Books Consortium. It's on the webpage, accessiblebooksconsortium.org. And you will find it there in Spanish, English, and French. So I think that's a good way to start making a commitment to accessible publishing.
Thank you, Hugo. And Kirsi, your thoughts?
Okay, I want to say to all the European publishers that don't wait until 2025 when the European Accessibility Act comes into force, but start now. Start learning how you can make your processes accessible and taking the accessibility into account right from the start. And then within 5 years you'll be experts on this, and you have to remember that this is accessibility is about learning. I mean, technology changes and tools changes. You just have the mindset to be willing to learn things and learning from the end users too.
Fantastic. So great thoughts from our panel there. Let's now turn to the results of our second poll. So the question was, what is the most significant barrier slowing inclusive publishing where you are? And the results are that coming in first is the business case is hard to make. 33% of you said that. Tying equally in second place is at 30% is don't know where to start and no strong laws to make it happen. And then I guess gratifying to see the tools do not exist. Not so many of you feel that that's a barrier. Only 7% of you feel that the lack of tools is what is impeding the progress of inclusive publishing. So thank you for completing that poll. Interesting results. We're coming to the end of this session. So thank you to our panelists for your great discussion and your information and your insights. And thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us for today's session. So coming up in the next few weeks, we have some more interesting sessions for you. On the July the 8th, pack your bags. We're going on a trip as we follow the journey from publisher to student, and we experience the accessible EPUB ecosystem in action. And on July the 15th, we'll talk about scaling inclusion in the transition to remote teaching. The rapid switch to online learning has in many cases amplified barriers facing some learners with disabilities. In this webinar, our friends from Blackboard Ally will share analysis which is driven by users from thousands of educational institutions from around the world, and will discuss pragmatic solutions for effective and efficient inclusion. And on July the 22nd, we will dig even deeper into describing images that Brad also touched on, and we'll get into the art and science of describing images. You can find out more at daisy.org/webinars, where you can also sign up to the webinar announcements mailing list to learn about new topics as we add them. If you'd like to suggest a subject, or if you're considering presenting a webinar yourself, then please email us at webinars@daisy.org. I hope you'll join us again next week. In the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.